Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. The Responsible Edge is a show for lessons in how to implement ethical and yet effective marketing. So each episode, I'm joined by an expert, but on this occasion, I was delighted to be joined by two. I had Clare Hill from Plant and Farm and Tom Chatfield from Make Hay. So a little bit of an introduction to Clare. So Clare is a practicing regenerative farmer with a wealth of experience in farm transition and at policy and corporate level. She's worked across the full spectrum of agri-food world for more than 20 years. So really experienced within the food and farming sector. She's developed Plant and Farm in Shropshire into a model for regenerative farming and offers workshops mentoring through her Roots to Regeneration Transition Accelerator program for farmers themselves. So some really interesting stuff going on within Clare's sphere. And then the other guest that we had today was Tom Chatfield from Make Hay. Make Hay are a consultancy delivering coaching and mentoring services to SMEs, primarily, I should say, in the food and farming sector. Tom's interests are really around finding holistic ways for businesses to operate for the good of the planet and humanity, and moving beyond traditional and extractive shareholder value. So those are my two guests today. They were absolutely fantastic. You'll really enjoy the conversation. In terms of what we covered, we began the conversation looking at kind of broad concerns around the use of the term regenerative in a farming or agriculture context. Really interesting. We looked at like the nuance, I guess, and the complexity of the use of the term and the importance of context. We then sort of aligned with that, talked about the importance of educating customers and more broadly stakeholders of the use of the term regenerative and what it actually means. We also touched on during our conversations the relationship between sales and marketing in a food and farming context, which is particularly interesting for any food and farming businesses out there. And then finally, we finished with the guys giving some really genuinely interesting and valuable advice for our junior marketeers out there. So just wanted to say a big thank you to Clare and Tom for joining us today for today's episode. And of course, for our listeners out there, for you guys for continuing to support us by listening to the show. If you do have any questions, comments or thoughts, again, we'd be really pleased to hear them. So please feel free to add any comments. Thank you all. Clare, can I just kick things off with you and just ask you for your take and perhaps reflections on the Modern Retail article that we shared previously, looking at the use of the term regenerative agriculture and its prominence as a sustainability buzzword. What did you kind of glean from and take from the piece?
Yeah, it's in this, we're in this kind of really difficult space where lots of people, organisations have made big commitments to regenerative agriculture. And I would suspect that many, or in fact, I have had a conversation this morning where people are kind of saying, yeah, we've made big commitments, but we didn't really know what regenerative agriculture was when we made the commitment. We thought it was another sustainability thing and we would just be able to add it on to what we were already doing. And so the article, I think, is reflective of what we see. This is sort of a kind of more US focused, I think, but what we see in the UK is something similar. Is there's some commitments been made, not as big as some of the US commitments, and something that's lacking in the UK is certainly a commitment of financial support for farmers to transition. But this kind of what we call the pilot era. We're in the pilot era where there's lots of pilots going on or supporting small groups of farmers, but what there hasn't been yet is this commitment to actually really supporting the change that is needed. So I think that this is a fairly reflective of what I'm seeing and what we're seeing in the UK.
Clare, that was absolutely brilliant in terms of the article. I do realise that perhaps for our listeners, it might be really helpful to almost kick off with a definition or an explanation of what regenerative farming actually is. Would you mind just providing us with one?
Yeah. So interestingly, well, there's always lots of debate about whether it can be defined, and in fact it is, because it's so context specific. The idea is that you get back in touch with your land, your farm, and what you want to do and what nature's trying to do there, and kind of work to harness that to grow food, rather than kind of taking this model of agriculture developed somewhere centrally and then applying it all over the place. So often it's challenging to actually define it down to one thing. So many people work with kind of descriptions as opposed to definitions. And the one from Terragenesis works quite well, I feel, which is regenerative agriculture is a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soil, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. So that works quite well as a description of what regenerative agriculture is.
And out of interest, on that point, do you get a sense that, if you're thinking about from a comms perspective, the use of regenerative farming in most contexts, it requires a lot more further explanation as to what you're actually referring to when using that term? Is it a fairly misleading term if it's not if there isn't a greater explanation as to the context of it? Would that be a fair thing to assert?
Yeah, it is. It's quite because it's not just one thing. It's not easy to communicate, and so for it can be challenging. And then there is potential for greenwashing within it, because some people have just said, oh well, it's just the new word for sustainable, so it's carrying on doing what we were already doing and just call it regenerative now. And their kind of lack of appreciation about what regenerative agriculture actually is. I think that fits in the kind of unintentional greenwashing bracket often, that it's not people are intentionally doing it, but that can happen. And so it's a difficult one to communicate, particularly in that quick moment that people have when making choices about food as to what to purchase.
If I can add to that, Charlie, I think from the point of view of a kind of marketeer, it's, you're often looking for that reductionist sort of point of entry that you can create for someone, right? And in regenerative agriculture, that's much more difficult because, unlike organic, say, where there is a certification system and there's a very clear you're either organic or you're not, regenerative is much more down to, what regenerative practitioners would call holistic context, which is as nuanced and varied as, as every farm, every family that's out there doing it could be. So you're not going to get that kind of common point that you can reduce down necessarily and explain to your target audience.
Does Tom, that was really well explained. In terms of the work that you guys do at Plant and Farm and the work that you do together, do you worry about the use of the term regenerative agriculture in terms of the way that you promote what you do, or do you think that from the way that you're able to explain the context that you kind of mitigate against concerns over misinterpretation?
I think that I don't worry about what we're doing. I do worry about misuse of the word more wholly. Yes, I don't worry about our misuse of the word because I'm confident in that, and I know that what we are seeing are regenerative outcomes. So that's the bit that often gets missed, is we're very input focused in what we do in food, and it's about lists of things that we're going to do. We very rarely measure the output of that. So most certification schemes that exist now are lists of things that you tick off, rather than when we're looking at regenerative outcomes, we're looking for, is our soil health improving? Is the water holding capacity of our soil improving? Have we got more layers in our fields now? So if we got photosynthesis happening at multiple layers, those are the regenerative outcomes that we're looking for. And we know that we are achieving those because we're measuring them. And so I feel confident that we are, but that's where it gets difficult for others to get into that level of how do we measure regenerative outcomes on farms across the country or across the world. When we're looking at larger food brands, then that's hard for them. And so that's where sometimes there is the potential for misuse of the word.
And is that, Claire, and that was fascinating, and is that because of their use of the word, perhaps looking at from an input perspective as opposed to being clear about output? So, for example, we are taking a regenerative approach, but not necessarily creating those regenerative outcomes? Is that the key distinction in terms of the misuse of the word?
Yeah, it's often around regenerative practices. So you'll often hear people talk about regenerative practices, which are doing things differently. So we might do mob grazing with cattle instead of set stock grazing, or we might use a direct drill instead of ploughing. And that is a practice. Now, all those practices are good, but they don't, if you just do one of those practices within an existing industrialized farming system, you won't necessarily, unlikely to get regenerative outcomes. So you might think you are now doing things regeneratively. But yeah, it needs to be we talk more about shifting from thinking about regenerative practices to regenerative principles. So are we in like farming in more in line with nature? Are we thinking about how we can harness that rather than fight with it? And then those are the practices, direct drilling, mob grazing, those are the things that we will use to help achieve the regenerative outcomes that we want. But just doing some of the practices alone isn't necessarily enough to lead to the outcomes.
It's fascinating because what you've just explained there, it literally does come back to the beginning of the conversation where there's so much nuance associated with the term that to just simply slap the term onto a piece of marketing collateral or a messaging, a piece of advertising, whatever else it might be, is really not going to, is likely to mislead in of itself unless there is this context that's provided, which obviously you've mentioned Plant and Farm. You guys are doing that in terms of the outcomes, but perhaps others are in fact, let me ask you a question, Claire. You mentioned before about how you feel that greenwashing occurring around the use of the term regenerative is not an intentional issue. Is it more educational? Is it the fact that people don't know what they're communicating?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, when you look at all the different, terms of greenwashing, green rinsing, I think is one we'll see. So lots of commitments having been made to we're going to be regen X, we'll source this amount of regen by 2030, 2040, and we'll see those commitments changing. But yeah, I think because there's a lack of understanding around what regenerative agriculture really means, and actually that it's a bottom-up thing, so it's very difficult to make a commitment top down. And so so I don't think it's that people have gone, I don't think people have sat there and intentionally come up with campaigns or commitments that mean that they want to intentionally mislead. It's a lack of understanding about what it really means, and a lack of and actually what we're seeing is a real lack of investment now, I would say, at farm level. Like, really, if you want to be regenerative, you might need to be putting money where it's needed to support farms. And also this often this, I don't quite know how to describe this, but this point around what we often see is commitments around regenerative agriculture from food brands, and then all the emphasis is put on the farmers to change, without any appreciation or realizing that actually as food businesses might need to change. So often we'd hear, we want the same grain to the same spec, the same variety on the same timings, and the farmers have got to do it regeneratively. There's that no willingness to change there, and that's again maybe a lack of realization that needs to happen, or it's very difficult within the structure of some corporates. But so sometimes when there's a lot more behind the story of regenerative than maybe with other sustainability messaging, and so it has led to some unintentional greenwashing, I would say.
And if I can just add to Claire's point there, I think there's a journey up to regenerative as well, which is, some of the things that might be, for example, considered regenerative practices would reduce harm. So they might improve how land is being farmed, and they might, for example, slow down the pace of destruction of soil, but they're not actually regenerating it. And so it's easy to be, I think, kind of righteous and sort of judge others about, they're not really regenerative. But there's also a very legitimate journey where, change happens step by step, right? And so if people are reducing harm and they're going towards those regenerative principles, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And equally, if you then have 100 farms in your supply chain, you might mandate some of those practices, and that that could do good, but it's not necessarily regenerative.
It's super interesting. Yeah, so it's not an absolute. This is a sliding scale. This is a journey that many organizations that are within the food and farming sector are ultimately going on. Just wanted to pick up on your point, Claire, about and actually, Tom, you backed it up there in terms of supply chain and in terms of mandating regenerative practices as being a requirement for, you know, a supplier within the supply chain. Thinking about it from a customer end, and obviously touching maybe, and this is going to get beyond my areas of comfort in terms of knowledge here, but in terms of comparing like regenerative to perhaps organic and the ways from a customer perception perspective, the impact of it. Can you guys just touch upon like the growth and development of regenerative and kind of where you see the term going in terms of its influence upon, you know, customer behavior?
Yeah, I think you know, we don't really have there's not very many opportunities. So from a customer end, it's not like you can go in a supermarket and make a choice between regenerative or non-regenerative. You know, the supply is not there yet, and often where people have kind of really you know, found themselves achieving lots of regenerative outcomes, they're often then selling direct through their own models in a local area. I think the actual link will come through nutrient density. So through food being the science is ever increasingly showing that food grown in a regenerative system is leading to much higher levels of micro and phyto, so plant nutrients, that have actually declined through the last 100 or so years through the rise of industrialized agriculture. So I think, I don't necessarily think we'll get to where we have like regen and non-regen. It'll be actually talking about nutrient density of things. And as far as the question around organic, organic, when done truly to the sense of what Eve Balfour set out when she set up the Soil Association, then that is you know, is a version of regeneration, and that you will get regenerative outcomes. What's happened, I guess, through the kind of standardizing of organic and lots of standards and input standards has meant that some farms are farming organically, as in they're doing what they need to do to get through, but it's maybe sometimes a version of industrialized agriculture. So it might be that we're still growing lots of annual crops, but instead of using chemicals to prepare the seed bed for the next year, or chemicals you know, to help support the crop, we're using a lot of tillage instead. So it's there's some organic is absolutely up there and regenerating, and some isn't. But what we do see is that organic farms have a much bigger head start, having needing to wean themselves off chemicals when they do start to take a more regenerative organic approach, rather than just a kind of going by the rules organic approach.
And Claire, on that point, are you, in your experience of what's going on in the sector at the moment, are organic farms seeing the value of transitioning or beginning to transition towards regenerative if they aren't already? Is that beginning to happen?
Yeah, so I think for some they were already there, and others are. For a while there's been a kind of like, and I was the same. So I was like, this farm's been organic for 20 years. There's nothing we could do that would, you know, surely we're at the peak of environmental stuff. Like, and then when I started, but we were organic, and for example, we were set stocking, so turning animals out into a field, leaving them there for a long time, not understanding the value of rest periods in a grazing rotation, and then started to realize that actually, we hadn't been doing everything that we could. So so I think that there had to start with, there's been some resistance, and I was part of that resistance, and then it's been now. I think we've realised that we didn't know it all, and that there's more to learn, and there are other ways of doing it. And they reference the regenerative organic standard there in America, which is you know, not something that's available here, but that kind of covers off both of those things. And many organic, although many regenerative farmers aren't organic, you know, there are people that are doing regenerative stuff, which, you know, an organic is not part of what they do for varying reasons.
Fascinating. Here's a slightly off the beaten track question, but are you generally optimistic about the future of farming in the sense of the adoption of regenerative and what that might mean for, let's talk UK based here at the moment, but are you optimistic?
Yeah, I am with regenerative farming as an opportunity. I am optimistic. I think that without it, I would be feeling not not very optimistic. It's very tough, and because of the industrialized system that we've all been part of developing, whether we're consuming the food that's coming out of it, or we're involved at a policy level, ultimately that's where we've ended up unintentionally. We never said let's just create this system that is degrading our soils, but we didn't really realize we've been all so focused on producing more food because we never wanted to go through rationing again. That's all been good, like that was all a good thing, and this is just that we're now dealing with the unintentional consequences of policy that was developed back then, and that's hard for us all because we're the ones at this stage and age having to make a lot of the changes. But what I see is never a farmer when they kind of really get into regenerative farming say, oh no, I want to go back, and it gives there's this added benefit of it. It ticks boxes like, yes, better soil health, better resistance to pest and disease, but what it changes is people, and it gives them some hope, because at times in farming at the moment it can feel very lonely and very unhopeful. It's very challenging dealing with increasing weather events, declining incomes, increased costs. It can feel quite desperate at times, whereas what regenerative agriculture offers is hope, and that feels really good. Everyone around it is very positive and buzzing, and that's really nice to be part of.
That was awesome, Claire. That was such a good synopsis of things. Out of interest, moving on from sort of the, as you say, that beacon of hope and light, if you like, that you've just described, in terms of education and in terms of things that you've seen done well and things that you've implemented with Plant and Farm, etc. I know that obviously you guys work directly with farmers, and then presumably that there's a degree of educational element that goes into that, but equally thinking about kind of broader awareness and understanding of regenerative practices, etc. amongst consumers. Can you just give me a flavor as to the things that you think have worked well in terms of the promotion of regenerative farming from an educational perspective, and perhaps where the opportunities lie? And Tom, I don't know if you want to jump into and put your 2 pennies worth in as well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Tom go first on that one, because I feel like I've done a lot of talking.
Yeah, happy to do that. I mean, I think, one of the challenges that Claire and I have worked a lot on is how to actually communicate to the farmers as well, right? So given all the challenges that Claire described, a lot of people are trying to sell stuff to farmers, and a lot of those things are massive investments, chemicals, tractors, whatever. And often those investments haven't come good, and not because of the will or the ability of the farmer. It's just they haven't necessarily been sold the right thing. And so there's a lot of, and because of the challenges of economics and, the lack of hope that Claire talked about, there's a mistrust of, anyone that says, I'm here to help you kind of thing. So, Claire has the benefit that she's got the direct experience of having done it, and that builds a lot of her kind of credibility and bona fides, if you like. But we still have to be very careful about, the conventional language that you might use to sell a mentoring or training or coaching type product is not necessarily going to be the right language for the farmers. And I guess the nature of, like when we talk about holistic context, that's very abstract in some ways, and it has a lot of hope and excitement to it. But farmers also need really like practical nuts and bolts. They need to understand how it's going to affect their bottom line and the work that they do in the fields and stuff. So yeah, there's some real challenges in that.
But Tom, and just to pick you up on that, is that process of almost kind of essentially taking the nuts and the bolts of what it is that regenerative farming, the hope that it offers, and almost sort of repurposing it, if you like, in terms of the way that it's represented. Is that helpful in terms of getting down to kind of some really clear, unambiguous language about regenerative farming? Has that been a useful process?
Yeah, I think we tried to do both. Like, I think within the value proposition, if you like, there is the abstract, the kind of, we're selling hope and we're selling the dream of, getting out of this rat race. And then, yeah, we can also talk about the practicalities, or Claire particularly, because she's been there and done it. She knows the difference in the growth rate of a lamb, or like the hours she works, those kind of things that are much more tangible.
And specifically thinking, Tom, about the work that you do at Make Hay regarding the kind of sales process, etc. When you've helped Claire with thinking about how to engage with farmers in this way, has it, and acknowledging that your previous comment that obviously they're bombarded with all of these solutions and offers, etc. Can you just provide a little bit of additional sort of reflection on the sort of sales experience that's had when engaging with farmers through Planten?
Well, I think Claire can probably speak better to that one.
Yeah, I think what we've created, I guess, is if I speak to that, is that Roots to Regeneration is a year-long transition program, and that has come from this recognition that what was happening is that farmers were going to like 1-day events or 2-day events, getting loads of information, and then going home and then maybe changing one little thing, or not actually being able to get around to changing anything at all, but realizing that it's sort of what we often get tempting to go down into the detail of one particular thing. So we might go to lots of sessions on soil health and get very obsessed with that, but realizing that actually what we need to do is stand back from what's happening and, you know, look at what's the bits that come easily on this farm, what are the bits that are difficult, where do we want to be in 50 or 100 years, and then creating a program to deliver that. So it's a combination of supporting and coaching, but also with, as Tom said, the practical details of what they might want to change, and that's called Roots to Regeneration. And then what for me particularly, so I work with Tom in because really I'm a farmer and food industry person, and I know nothing. I want to create these things, and then I need other people to want to do them. Otherwise, there's no point. There's no point in creating them. And so, but what's been great is working with Tom is this like understanding of that we're not just there about trying to sell something, you know, loads more of it. It's about understanding, you know, how to work with people and what they really need, and what are the bits that are preventing change at the moment. So it's been a kind of an approach like that, and working with me on how to do that and how to talk with people about it. I'm not sure I'm explaining this very well now.
No, you've explained it brilliantly, and I think I think it's a fascinating thing. Out of interest, have you guys done any degree of kind of like, you know, surveying or research pieces with your farmers or with the farming community that's helped you kind of, as you've alluded to, kind of build that, you know, that clarity around what they specifically, the experiences that having, the pain points that they're going through, and then ultimately the offer that you're looking to deliver to resolve those issues? Have you talked through perhaps how you've gained that insight?
Claire, along with Caroline at Roots to Regeneration, has done a lot of work looking at the kind of overall size of the market and what's on offer to farmers. And, you know, it's quite clear that there was something that was not as kind of holistic and really something that got their arms around the farmers in the way that the program is designed to do. And one of the other things that, you know, I often come back to that really stood out when we were talking about this opportunity and what we were selling is the what's it called, the distribution of innovation curve, one that Simon Sinek talks very ably about, where the sort of, it's kind of a bell shape roughly, and what we're interested in with this work is the early adopters, pioneers, kind of early majority, that end of the spectrum. So the people that aren't necessarily looking for something that's completely proven and risk-free, you know, but they will get out there because they want to be the pioneers and they'll take those risks to do it. So that, I think that's been a key thing that we've identified, because if Claire gets up and talks to 100 farmers, you know, 95 of them they might find it very interesting, but, you know, it's not necessarily going to provoke them to change from what they do now. And that can be difficult when you get up in front of 100 farmers and sort of speak your heart out, and only 4 or 5 of them put their hand up, but actually it's that 4 or 5 that are going to make this difference. So I think that's been an important distinction in the research, if you like.
Yeah, that has been that has been absolutely key, because often in my work with other corporate organizations, what we all want to do is we want to bring the masses along with us. So any other farming program where I've worked, where programs working with farmers, it's been about, right, well, we need to, it's this theory that we've got to target those that aren't ready to change, because they what make up the majority. But since Tom and I started working with that distribution of innovation curve, it was absolutely like we're really still in the pioneer early adopter stage with regenerative agriculture. And if you listen to Simon Sinek talk, as Tom introduced me to, then you just have got to get to 17.5%. And so for now, I mean, it's really clear, and it's brought a real clarity to my work, which is I haven't got to try and convince everybody. We talk about this phrase, we talk about people being regen curious. If they're regen curious, that's what that's what we work with. And then nobody that needs to feel like they have to move all of a sudden, but if people are curious, come with us on the journey. Once we get to 17.5% of people doing it, then it kind of tips over there's a tipping point there where it tips over into mainstream, and that's how to achieve it. And the confidence that's given me has been unreal. Like as Tom says, when speaking to people, going in knowing that 90% of the people aren't going to be interested in what I say, but actually we're on that bit. So going with that as an approach to what our work that we're doing has been amazingly liberating, actually, and not feeling like we've got to convince everybody, because that often can feel quite overwhelming. So that's been really good.
It's absolutely fascinating for anyone else out there that I guess finds themselves in a similar situation where, looking to encourage the adoption of a new process, a new way of doing things, a new product, a new service, whatever it might be, that having that appreciation and understanding that it is about that tipping point, that 17.5%, as you've alluded to, Claire. I think that's incredibly liberating for a lot of people out there that are probably, bitten a lot of nails down and worried themselves about perhaps the lack of adoption. Here's a question for you that is maybe going to be difficult to answer, but do you see, let's envision that you get to your 17.5%. What happens at that point in terms of the communication challenges? What do you view the change being at that point in terms of use of language, channels, the sort of the way in which you go about communicating the adoption of regenerative agriculture?
That's a good question. At the moment, the way people often come to it is they read a book written by someone not in this country, and because we haven't got many books written by people here with exploring their experiences, and it tend to be, in the early days, it was like, well, what can you advise I do next? And it was basically get on YouTube and start following a load of people around the world doing things. But what's been great to see is the rise of events or talking around regenerative agriculture, and there various depths of regeneration. So there's Groundswell, there's Down to Earth, there's the Hutchinson's Agroecology Conference. There's lots of them popping up. The Agroforestry Show, and what's amazing about those, of course, is that they bring about a community element as well. So touching into this is really about people changing, and that's been an amazing. I think that's really given everybody a lot of support, and I think channels wise, it's the also what is really taking off is people learning through podcasts, actually. So I know we're here on one, but that's been a real change. Like within podcasts work really well because a lot of the time you're out and about on farm, but you're maybe in the tractor or you're walking the land looking at something, and then you can be listening to something at the same time. So actually it's been a I think that's a really interesting. And webinars, there's loads of them. So that's where the kind of education and communication stuff is coming from now. But some people actually do feel a bit like they don't like. There has been an element, I would say, of us in the people in the regen movement who it can be a bit evangelical. So some people have become so excited about it. But I think it's just because they get so excited about the opportunities that it becomes, and that does turn people off. And some people get very wound up about the word, and it's like, it's just a word. I don't know why it triggers so much. But and I think that is valid. I think that has been, and I've probably been part of that myself at times. I've just been so excited about it that, you know, bore on about it a bit too much when people aren't so interested. But yeah, that has been a kind of negative element, I guess, of what's happened around communication about regen within the farming industry.
There's almost a bit of a kind of we were here first mentality that sometimes prevails, but I think when reaching that kind of crossing the chasm 17.5% point, you know, that I think will dissipate over time. I think the complexity of the message, just because of the change that's required, will continue to be as demanding, if you like, as in, you know, you'll have to read a book or listen to a few hours of podcast to really start to grasp what it's about. But hopefully there'll be more a sense of like, we're all in this together, and I guess more trust, rather than it just being the sort of weirdos in the corner. You know, it will be like your 2 or 3 of your neighbors maybe do it, or the guy you buy some stock from, or something like that, you know.
Yeah, so it normalizes, I guess, the adoption of the practices, essentially.
Yeah, that it becomes aspirational as well, I think, where at the moment, for some people, they have that aspiration, but it's not, you know, I guess that tipping point comes because it becomes more universal that people want to make that change.
Super interesting. Claire, coming back to your point about channels, what do you guys do? Obviously, you've got your program, which, sorry, I can't remember the exact title of the program. It was Roots to
Regeneration.
Roots to Regeneration. I should remember that. It's easy to recall. Roots to Regeneration. Is there anything that you're doing kind of before? Obviously, you're doing podcasts, you're doing events, etc., that you're kind of, you know, speaking the message, etc. Is there anything else that you're offering as kind of that early stage, initial kind of educational piece, or is it very much talking to people about it and then getting farmers onto that program, or is there anything in between?
Yeah, I mean, yes. So, there is a little bit, and I'd love to be doing more. And I guess it's just trying to work out how best to do it. So we do a 1-day soil mentor training day. So it's called a soil day with soil mentor, and Soil Mentor is an app to use to measure or learn about your own soil health and what's happening, and to measure change over time. Everyone's always obsessed with the measurement element of everything. It's about linear, you know, we're going to reduce this or increase this by X%. But really what Soil Mentor does is gives a tool for interacting with the land in a way that maybe you hadn't before, or unlocking what it's trying to tell you or what it's doing in a way that we've never been taught how to read before. For example, you know, are there lots of gaps between all the grass plants, or are they closely packed together? Is there compaction happening when the rain hits the water? Often we think when the rain hits the land. And so what Soil Mentor does is gives us that, but it's a bit of a new way of looking at things. So it's quite difficult to sort of get going with. So yeah, we do 1-day courses, which are on learning how to use the app, but also we're taking what we're seeing, and then how might we change our management in order to head in a more regenerative direction, not getting really bogged down in regen ag, but just how might we do things a bit better for our soil. So we do 1-day courses on that, and we have a sort of semi-strong LinkedIn presence and a bit of Instagram as well. And we are working on because doing more kind of thought leadership pieces, actually some of the unspoken conversations or the things that don't get talked about so much, actually bringing those out. So centralization of animal genetics, you know, becoming increasingly owned by corporate companies that are sometimes aligned with pharmaceutical companies. You know, should we be concerned, or are we okay with that? We've got a declining number of breeds. We've got a seed sovereignty movement. People are very interested in making sure that we've got diversity of seeds, and should we be doing the same on animal genetics? So we're doing a little bit of research on that at the moment, and so to do more thought leadership around that and put more pieces out there is what we want to do. But at the moment we've this is a good reminder that I put that back high up on my thing. But that's what we do at the moment.
It's just, and just to add to what Claire said, that sort of thought leadership means there's this increasing infrastructure of referrals, basically from any of those kind of people that Claire mentioned, and veterinarians and so on, that if they see that indication that someone is in that early adopter space, the idea with the thought leadership is that they then think of Plantain and give Claire a call, like that.
Brilliant. Well, as expected, Tom, it's clear that you've given some real thought to that kind of nurturing ecosystem, if you like, and we get Claire. It's always a task to find additional time and resource to sort of aid that, funnel developing, lead nurturing kind of part of things. Slightly switching focus, just I wanted to ask more broadly about and this is a question to kind of both of you, your views about information and the dissemination of information within the food and farming sector more broadly. Obviously, we've focused very specifically so far in the conversation on regenerative agriculture and the use of that term. But if you look at things more broadly, like how plagued do you see the industry with misinformation as an issue, and or not? Just provide a bit of a commentary on the way that you view things in that sense, please.
That's fun.
I think it depends on the sort of defining of misinformation. What I think there is still a lot of again, like unintentional greenwashing, but so there would still be a lot of it. What people like is when things are proven and backed by science, and often the people that fund research and science into things are those that are set to benefit from the sale of a product at the end of it. When it comes to more agroecological or regenerative systems, often it's nature that's going to benefit and other things, but there's no product attached to it. Therefore, the research to go in to prove things to a point where they feel comfortable, because we've all grown up with a very mechanistic and reductionist kind of thinking unless it's been proven and peer reviewed in 10 papers, we don't believe it. But there's the money isn't going in to do that research because there isn't a product attached to it. So therefore, it can be very difficult to make decisions when there's loads of research saying if you use this product on your crop or your grass, you're going to get these results, and we've proven that time and time over. Or me saying, actually, if you just let it grow and rested it for longer, you would see some of those same results in time. Well, prove it, show me, where's the results? And we don't have the proven. They don't come as easily, all of the proven science results. And I think where we are at now is actually there's a mass of people who are doing it and talking positively about it, that it doesn't need the proof so much. But definitely that is one of the things that lacks. So therefore, some people are still pushing the bits that they know it works and they feel very safe, because it can feel very unsafe to say try something different without all that scientific backing, and particularly in roles, this is the way that we've created the industry. But for example, vets and agronomists, more often than not, their role is linked to the sale of products. As farmers, we're not used to or often willing to pay for their advice. We like the fact that we get our agronomist for free, but not realizing that it's not really for free. That's where they make the money. But there's a mindset shift for all of us involved in that, and that the tide is changing on that. But that's the reality of how it is now. So that's why I say it's unintentional. People might be worried about trying something new when the product element, side of things is more proven.
And out of interest, Claire, when you talk there about the science, I mean, are you, and I totally get what you're saying, which is that until the product is there, then the science, the investment in that scientific rigor, if you like, to underpin it, isn't developed. How do you see that resolving itself? Are we never going to have that kind of research and insight, scientific base that underpins regenerative, or is it something that you see coming?
I think it will come, but from a different angle to what we're used to. So it'll come through, the value businesses needing to resolve their scope 3 emissions, their farm level or production level emissions, and the businesses needing to do that, or biodiversity net gain, where builders will now have to offset their biodiversity, and the people with land are farmers, and that's going to be naturally maybe quite lucrative, or actually put some proper value back on farmland. But also, I don't know if it necessarily needs to be. I think we'll also reach a point of critical mass where there's lots of people doing it and they're seeing good results, that we don't actually need to have it written and proven in the way that maybe we used to. And I think we're already seeing that. 3 or 4 years ago was like, show me the science, show me the science, show me the data. Well, we don't have that. What I have is stories. But now there's enough story, and they were sort of a few individuals. And of course, the response to those is often, well, it works for them on their farm, but it won't work on ours. But now there's almost a critical mass of so many stories that it's less. Basically, I just don't hear that question quite so often. As far as it still comes up, prove, data. But actually, particularly with farmers now, they're hearing enough stories of good stuff that they're not maybe still at a corporate level where it's still about needing to report and needing numbers. We're still hearing that, but actually at farm level, there's less of that proof needed because the stories are gaining momentum.
It's almost like that kind of ultimate social proof that you're developing, isn't it? You're, as you say, these stories that are, I mean, essentially in of itself, if you have enough stories, that becomes a body of data to infer the value of what you're doing. Claire, Tom, I have to admit that has been an absolute like whistle stop tour of regenerative agriculture. I have to admit, I felt like I've had an absolute crash course. I clearly need to read a lot more about regenerative agriculture myself, but my basic understanding from what you've been through, which was brilliant today, is that what you're doing sounds absolutely fantastic, and really exciting to see regen agriculture develop. Claire and Tom, we're kind of heading towards the end of our conversation. We always like to finish with just asking for your sort of number one or a key bit of advice that you would offer to any of the aspiring more junior marketeers or communication specialists out there. Obviously, we've spoken very specifically about farming and regenerative agriculture today, but anything that you guys would offer up as a key bit of advice to somebody looking to communicate these themes?
I think what comes to mind for me is, kind of picking up on the last point about that ultimate social proof thing. Like for farmers, it's, their family businesses. Most farmers live where they work. There's no divide between those two things. So I guess, a deep understanding of what is going on there is going to serve any young marketeer very, very well, which might not be borne out in the data.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of that trust your gut thing in some ways.
And have a real sort of, I guess, a nose for the story and an understanding and appreciation of where that might lead you.
Yes, and more so, I think that how to translate that story into what would make sense to a farmer. Because if you haven't grown up on a farm, or you're not in that world, it is kind of a different version of reality. So, you need to figure out how you're going to navigate your way to that world kind of thing, and get to know some farmers or go and intern on farms, that kind of thing.
Fascinating. Thanks. Claire, any golden nuggets?
Yeah, I think so firstly to understand the depth of to get your head around maybe the depth of the topic, in order that the communication is accurate. But the other one is actually building on Tom's bit a little, is realizing that sometimes it can get quite blamey. Oh, farmers have done this, they're not doing this, they're getting rid of hedges, they're doing all these bad things. There's a kind of recognition that the average age of farmers of where the majority of them are, that this stuff was all been told was the right thing to do when they were doing it. And so now that narrative is changing, and so that people are going through, it's not just a change of it's not just a doing something, just using this pen instead of that pen. It's a total culture change, and that is that's hard, because in some cases what we're sort of learning is what we should be doing now is in some ways almost the polar opposite of what we've been doing or what we've been taught to do, and that's really hard. That's really difficult, and farmers do seem to sit in this kind of blame thing. So I think it's definitely coming at it from a place of compassion and understanding for that is really key.
Fantastic, guys. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you both for joining me, and really appreciate you sharing some of those insights over the last 3/4 of an hour. So thanks you both for joining.
Thank you.